Yeah, it's either multiple tabs or speakers and microphone from two different places, like computer speakers and external microphone.
Hi, everyone. The next panel will be starting shortly, so if everyone could come in and take a seat, that would be great. Thank you.
I wonder if this is better.
You sound clear.
Okay, I did find another tab. So thanks for pointing that out. So where are you, Olga?
I'm at CVPR, so I'm in New Orleans in a hotel room. Thankfully, I brought a nicer camera, so I brought it because I was running a tutorial here, so I wanted a camera for my co-presenter who was virtual, but it worked out really well for this panel because I think the laptop camera would not have held up in a hotel room at 7:30 at night with terrible lighting.
I'm at home in Atlanta, so.
Oh, nice.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm at home.
Good. How long is this panel? An hour?
I believe so.
Yeah. It's too long and too short at the same time. It's just the problems that are so overwhelming, I think.
Of yours and the Kearns.
Hi, everyone. We'll be starting very shortly, so please take your seats as quickly as possible. All right, let's go ahead and get started then. So thank you everyone so much for attending Fact 22 and our first keynote panel of this year's conference. So this is a panel on implementing intersectionality in algorithmic fairness. So of course, intersectionality is an incredibly important topic for us to think about in the fairness space. Oftentimes, we think about fairness simply in terms of specific dimensions in isolation, but when we think about how to actually address bias and discrimination in sociotechnical systems, it's impossible to do that properly without thinking about intersectional dimensions. And so we have a really illustrative and very interdisciplinary panel here who has very kindly offered their time and expertise with us today. So to kick things off, I'd love if everyone could just briefly introduce themselves and also just talk a little bit about the work that you all do in intersectionality. So let's actually start with our virtual panelists. So Yolanda, would you like to go first?
Good morning for those of you who are there on site, and good evening for those who may be joining remotely. I'm delighted to be here with this distinguished panel of speakers. My name is Yolanda Rankin. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Information at Florida State University. And I came into intersectionality from more of a personal experiences. As a Black woman in computing, I have worked in industry for more than 12 years in places like AT&T, Bell Labs, most recently IBM Research in San Jose, California. And it struck me as I was moving and navigating in these spaces and industry that I would typically be the only Black woman in the room, sometimes in a particular organization. And I had to believe that there was a reason for the underrepresentation of Black women in this space, right? What is accounting for this? And so I began to do some systematic research, digging, probing, interviewing Black women in different phases of their careers. And I discovered that intersectionality was a useful lens for centering their experiences and understanding the issues that we deal with in the space of looking for access to technology, looking for access at the tables where decisions are made about what's being designed in terms of innovation, looking for acknowledgement and visibility, having our voices heard. And so intersectionality for me was a way to understand the complexity of those experiences that I and other Black women were having in this space. And so today, I'm delighted to talk about how intersectionality can be used as a critical lens for when we're seeking to invoke social justice and understand what's happening behind the scenes when we look at who's not at the table and we're making these key decisions. And so I'll pause there.
Thanks so much, Yolanda. Olga, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Yeah, absolutely. So hello, everybody. So I'm Olga Rysakovsky. I'm an assistant professor in computer science at Princeton. I'm a computer vision researcher, so I'm at CVPR, the Computer Vision Conference right now, which is why I couldn't be there in person with you all, but I would have very much liked to be there. So as a computer vision researcher, right, so I am an engineer at heart that sort of builds computer vision systems, and I think about, right, with all of the challenges with visual recognition these days, how it's being deployed in so many different applications, and it's sort of starting to work pretty well for some definitions of pretty well, and I've kind of witnessed that during my PhD, and as an assistant professor, it's kind of keeps getting more and more accurate for some definitions of accuracy, but also is starting to more and more fail in all kinds of settings where we would really like it not to fail, and starting to cause real social issues and real social harms. And so we've been thinking about, right, as a computer vision engineers, machine learning engineers, how could we mitigate some of these issues, some of the biases in the systems? And recently I've started thinking about it from an intersectional perspective, or really from a very, very simple intersectional perspective, I would say. So just, trying to push ourselves from thinking about a single attribute with two binary labels, but a little bit more complex. And I'll give a huge shout out to my student, who's Angelina Wang. Hi, Angelina, who is there at FACT. So if you haven't met her, you should. She was really the person who kind of pushed me to start thinking in that direction. We have a paper that she will present at FACT called Towards Intersectionality in Machine Learning. You'll hear about this week.
Great, thanks, Olga. And Cynthia? Oh, you're muted.
You'd think I would have learned by now. All right. So I'm Cynthia Dwork. I'm delighted to be here with you and honored to be part of this panel. I'm a professor of computer science at Harvard and also a distinguished scientist at Microsoft. And I really heard you, Yolanda, having spent several decades in industry, including at IBM Research in San Jose. And I was very, very often the only woman in the room. Not intersectional, but nonetheless unique. I've been working on algorithmic fairness since the summer of 2010, when together with Hart, Patassi, Reingold, and Semmel, sort of launched the theoretical investigation of algorithmic fairness, trying to lay down some basic definitions of what could fairness mean and how could we build fair systems and what could we prove couldn't be done and so on. And early work in the field sort of split fairness criteria into two categories, what I would call group fairness conditions, which are basically requiring certain kinds of statistical equivalences across different demographic groups. And typically these were disjoint demographic groups. And then what we called individual fairness, which intuitively says that similar people should be treated similarly. And of course, the first approach, the group fairness, runs into impossibility results. And the individual fairness is sort of great from a theoretical point of view, but it demands a resolution to the question of how do we determine for a pair of individuals in a given task how similar or dissimilar they are. So there has been a lot of progress on that in the last few years, but in a new approach that was initiated by Eber Johnson, Kim Reingold, and Rothblum, and also Kearns, Neal, Roth, and Wu, investigates group fairness constraints over large numbers of arbitrarily intersecting large groups. And this has turned out to be a very fruitful direction, and that is how I got to intersectionality.
Okay, thank you, Cynthia. And Eugene?
Oh, yeah. Hi. Oh, I'm Eugene Kong, and I'm an incoming assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Georgia. So I guess I'm one of the few philosophers who are attending this conference, but I grew up in Seoul, so I feel like, yeah, we're home to this place. So that's basically where I'm from. And as a philosopher, intersectionality has been the core to my research in feminist philosophy and philosophy of race. So for example, my recent article in the journal Ergo, it examines the metaphysics of marginalized identities, and I propose understanding identity like race identity and gender identity as a fluid process rather than some fixed entity that is just given to us. So in order to build such a theory, I'm drawing on intersectional experiences of women of color, especially Asian women and Asian American women, how we experience this racism, xenophobic racism and sexisms, and also language-based discriminations and things like that at the intersection of these operations. So yeah, that's basically how I'm working on intersectionality in philosophy. And when it comes to AI, I also work on how the AI fairness literature interprets the intersectionality and uses for analyzing bias and improving fairness. So that's one of the topics I'm working on related to intersectionality. So for example, in the paper that I will be presenting this Thursday, I critically analyzed the dominant interpretation of intersectionality and so-called intersectional fairness in AI, and I argue that there are some kind of fundamental problems with it, and I argue that there could be some better ways to interpret and employ intersectionality in the AI fairness literature. So yeah, well, I'm very happy to be part of this important conversation. And thank you, Alice and everyone, for having me here. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Jimmy, would you like to introduce your work as well?
Hi, everybody. I'm James Folds. You can call me Jimmy. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. So my background is in probabilistic machine learning, topic models and things like that. And I was always interested in computational social science, just trying to think about how do you connect these models to real people. And that was part of what steered me towards fairness. I also had a detour working in privacy just a little bit. But what really started me in the direction was Kate Crawford's and Europe's talk in 2017. That made it clear to me that this was going to be a direction that I could go in. You know, it was always something that I cared about, but I thought nobody else did. So seeing that this was going to be a big deal helped me to have the confidence to go in that direction. In terms of intersectionality, mostly got into that because of my wife, Dr. Rosie Carr. She's a feminist scholar and focuses on intersectionality. So she kind of put that bug in my brain. And my work in intersectional fairness, I mostly take this intersectional approach, as I said. So I've worked on fairness definitions. I believe we'll have an interesting conversation since this is one of the ones that Eugene is possibly critiquing, but I'm happy to have that conversation. I also work on algorithms, especially estimating intersectional fairness with the small subgroups and how to learn with that challenge of estimating it from data. And I'm also interested in connecting to human-computer interaction and the humanities, trying to have a broader picture on fairness and not just the algorithms or the theory. Thanks.
Great. Thank you all so much. And thank you so much for making your time to join the panel today. And I realized I forgot to introduce myself earlier. Hi, everyone. My name is Alice Xiong. I'm the Global Head of AI Ethics at Sony and also one of your FACT 22 General Co-Chairs. So to kick off this discussion, of course, we don't have a singular definition for intersectionality. There's many different definitions proposed in the literature. But to start this discussion, I'm curious, Eugene, how would you define intersectionality?
Yeah, to start off, intersectionality basically refers to the idea that race, gender, class, sexuality, and so on, they are not separate, but more like intersect and operate together. So basically, all types of discrimination are not mutually exclusive and separate them, but they intersect together. So according to Kimberlee Crenshaw's well-known analogy, it's like women of color, especially Black women, is standing at the intersection of racism road and sexism road. So she is hit by traffic on both roads. So that's how this concept of intersectionality has been popularized as this useful analogy in virtually all kinds of sciences, social sciences, humanities, and engineering, and so on. So I'm really glad to see that intersectionality has becoming more and more important in this AI fairness approach. And one thing I really like to emphasize is that intersectionality is not merely about identity, but more about the structural operation. Because when it comes to intersectional fairness in AI, we used to, really focus on, here's, Black people and white people. And it's not just that, but Black people is also divided into Black women and Black men, or probably Black non-binary people as well, and so on. And so generally, generating more fine-grained combinations of race, gender, and more identity categories. But when it comes to Black feminist thought, which first makes this concept of intersectionality and popularizes intersectionality, the key idea is that it is more like racism, sexism, and ableism, this sort of structural oppression. They intersect to marginalize these groups rather than just generating more fine-grained combination of subgroup and more, just even finer subgroups. That's one of the key points, but I would emphasize that it's not just either identity or structural oppression, but it's about identity that is shaped by and also lived in the structural oppression, such as sexism, racism, and so on.
Thank you. And Yolanda, your work really highlights some additional dimensions to this question. So I'm curious how you would define intersectionality. Oh, and you're muted.
Yes, I'm having the same. Remember to unmute myself. I second exactly what Eugene is saying. When you start to look at issues beyond just identity, you start to look at issues of power, meaning who is advantaged or who has privilege, whose voice is being heard, who determines the rules. It's when you begin to look at that you can also understand that intersectionality is really a way to understand the complexity that comes about because we as human beings are not one-dimensional. And once you begin to recognize that, then you can begin to see how different aspects of humanity interact with one another. So not only is it an issue, as Eugene mentioned, about race, gender, class, but you begin to look at nationality, the native language that is spoken. So, and you think about the classroom setting, you could think of who's advantaged in our education system in the classroom. And it would be that English is the language of choice, fine. But at the same time, that assumption is that English is the preferred language of choice, when in reality, there are hundreds of languages in the world. And even in the United States, English is not the official language. I don't know if people realize that or not, but it's not. It's just understood to be the dominant language. So that being the case, you begin to shift your perspective in terms of how you view the human experience, understanding that most people don't come into uh, this world in a one-dimensional frame. So able-bodiedness, sexual orientation, again, nationalism, the language that you speak, class, there are multiple axes at play that define your lived experience on a day-to-day basis. And this is where the complexity lies. And so while it's easy to look at things from a binary perspective, it's inadequate when we're talking about human beings. Now you add the context of algorithms or technology or innovation, and it becomes even murkier, right? Even more complex, because now the questions are who, again, has access to technology? How is that technology used? Who does it benefit? Who does it disadvantage? So a simple scenario would be one such as a cashless setting where you go into a store and the whole idea is that you're not exchanging cash or coins. It's a cashless transaction, something you can do over your phone. That sounds great, right? In terms of us wanting to make sure that we don't, say, for example, interact with one another in a way that exposes people, say, in the context of COVID-19. That sounds great. But then for someone on the issue of class, and you talk about cashless transactions, then it's about having this presumption of having money in a bank account, having a credit card, having a phone which has the ability to load uh, money, currency on it, so that you can operate and be empowered to purchase and buy and bargain as you see fit. Well, who's not at the table? Someone who doesn't have, say, for example, access to banks or credit, issues of that, which speaks to not just class, but also talks about who's disadvantaged along the lines of race, who's disadvantaged along the lines of nationality, and even language when it comes to the interfaces that govern these cashless transactions. So we have to think about these things when we're looking at, again, the human experience, which is not just this one-dimensional experience that we're having. We're coming at this from multiple axes that are shaping the experiences that we're having, with not just inside the homes, but with other people who do not necessarily have the same background as we may have.
Thanks so much, Yolanda. And certainly that emphasis on power, I think, is so informative for the work that we do in this space. So many folks in the algorithmic fairness space are quite familiar with the idea of different technical definitions of fairness, which tend to not be intersectional in practice. So Cynthia, I'm curious, why would you say intersectionality is so important to incorporate into technical conceptions of fairness?
So a wonderful answer to why is it so important is the title of a paper by Aaron Roth and others, Michael Kearns and Aaron Roth and others, which is Fairness Gerrymandering, Auditing and Learning for Subgroup Fairness. And I think that fairness gerrymandering sort of says the whole thing, that if you only take into account single axes when you're building, let's say, a classifier or a scoring function, you simply will fail to be fair or to be accurate or to be calibrated or to satisfy whatever the requirement is on the intersection of the groups that are defined by multiple axes. So in some sense, you just get it wrong. So that's why it's important. Was that the whole question?
Thanks, Cynthia. I think that does a great job of summarizing it. And I think, Jimmy, you had some additional points you want to make on this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So why is it important? I mean, so we've been hearing a lot from the panelists on why it matters. But of course, intersectionality is a valuable critical lens for thinking about injustice in our society. And as such, we should consider its application to algorithms as well. And as we know, intersectionality thinks about not just gender by itself or not just race by itself, but all these intersections. And beyond that, it also talks about systems of power and oppression in our society. And I think it's really important to take into account that context when defining fairness. And so it's a great framework for actually thinking through, what are the challenges in our society that end up in our algorithms that we need to kind of correct for. So in one of my papers, we proposed a fairness definition called differential fairness, building on Cynthia's work on differential privacy and trying to adapt it to a fairness framework. And we came at this from trying to create a intersectional definition of fairness. So in the longer version of my paper, this is the short one is on ICDE 2020, and we have an archive paper, which is a bit longer. We have some desiderata for what an intersectional definition of fairness should be. And see if I can remember them from the top of my head. And this is not the be-all and end-all. I know that you'll probably have more to say. But the first one, obviously, we should handle multiple protected attributes, right? That's obvious. And the second part, obviously, we should try to protect fairness at the intersection of those groups, right? So I think so far we're all on the same page. I would go a little further than that. You also don't want to sacrifice fairness for kind of the top level groups. You still want to protect women, right? You don't want to leave women behind by trying to protect Black women or white women. Another one is that we would like to protect minority groups. And I mention this because this is one critique we had for the paper that Cynthia was mentioning, was that it specifically downweights minority groups. But minority groups are often the most harmed by these systems of oppression in our society, so we don't want to leave them behind. The last one, and I think Eugene will have more to say on this, but we want to make sure we correct for systems of oppression in our society, right? And even when they're in the data, and I think this is quite crucial, and I think this is something that many fairness definitions miss, is we need to actually understand that our society has these injustices in it. And those injustices end up in our data, and the data is what the algorithms are trained on, right? So then our algorithms are going to have these problems, and it's in the data. If you just correct to make the algorithm behave like the data, you won't have solved the whole problem. So you need to be willing to push back against what is just in the data to correct the fundamental issues in our society that are reflected in the data. So those are at least some of the criteria that we believe an intersectional fairness metric should take into account. We've put forth one notion. It's certainly not perfect. It also, I believe that fairness is highly contextual, and so one definition is never going to do it by itself. And I think there needs to be more work on modeling the systems of oppression, and we take a very simplistic approach, which is basically just a kind of parity-based approach, which just assumes that all differences are due to systems of oppression, but I think a more nuanced study of that would be warranted. It's just very difficult. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Jimmy. And Eugene, you have some important critiques in this area.
Yeah, I think it's important to incorporate intersectionality into AI fairness research, basically for two main reasons. So first of all, intersectional biases are greater than the sum of each bias. So if you think of the groundbreaking work by Blom, Winnie, and Gabriel, so you can see that this major face recognition algorithms, they do some at least some decent, obviously they are doing the best job on recognizing white male faces, but they do a decent job recognizing white women and black men's faces. But for black women, they, the major face recognition algorithms, they are not only doing the worst on recognizing their faces, but even compared to white women and black men, they are doing the worst, much worse jobs than those marginalized groups as well. So if shows that, so basically those major face recognition algorithms are failing to recognize about 3 out of 10 black female faces. Although they do, produce at least more than 95 or so percentage of accuracy rates on other marginalized groups such as white women and black men. So this is, I think, this is a clear illustration of what Kimberlee Crenshaw says as well, the intersectional marginalization that black women or women of color are facing, that is greater than the sum of sexism that white women are facing and racism that black men are facing. So we cannot just adequately address this intersectional bias only with the single axis of racism or sexism, because it is not just just some of them, not just addition of them. And in addition to this point, I also want to point out that intersectional bias is also qualitatively different from the respective biases. So it is greater than the sum and also qualitatively distinct operation. So as an example, I'd like to talk about this mortgage lending practices, which are notoriously biased against people of color and also non-heterosexual couples. So one research shows that in the US, the non-heterosexual couples or queer couples are much more likely to be denied a mortgage than otherwise similar heterosexual couples. So basically, it's clear that this heterosexism is prevalent in mortgage lending practices, and also this loan approval algorithms are basically reproducing this sort of heterosexism in the data set. But it's also important to note that bias that queer people of color are experiencing, so this intersectional bias of heterosexism and racism, it is not the same heterosexism that white queer people are experiencing. So we cannot just use the same lens or whatever same criteria for this analyzing and fixing this heterosexist bias in loan approval algorithms that can be working for white queer people. That is not the same as the kind of bias that queer people of color are experiencing. So given that this intersectional bias is greater and also qualitatively distinct from the respective biases, I think it's very important to incorporate this intellectual and practical contribution of intersectionality into this cutting edge research of AI fairness.
Thank you all so much for those insights. And so we've talked a little bit about why intersectionality is so important, but of course in practice what often makes it quite difficult for practitioners to implement is that intersectionality does dramatically increase the number of subgroups that folks are concerned with. So let's just take, for example, if you have 5 age groups, 10 geographies, suddenly you have 50 subgroups, since intersectionality is multiplicative versus additive. And so in practice, oftentimes researchers make simplifying assumptions in order to model intersectionality. And I'm curious, Olga, how do you think we can think about what is appropriate versus inappropriate when folks are making these simplifying assumptions?
Yeah, that's a very hard question, because I think machine learning in general, right? It thrives on simplifications. That's sort of at the once you're given a particular loss function or a particular metric, machine learning can optimize it, and that's sort of, to some extent, that's the whole field, as we kind of create a benchmark with the task, or we create a metric that we want to measure, and then we build models that sort of optimize that, right? And in thinking about, what simplifications are acceptable or reasonable, whether it's in intersectionality or in any kind of topic or task, right? The real question is like, are we sort of moving in the right direction? So if we're here now working with our, single protected attribute and binary version of this, right? And if we're trying to get somewhere here with modeling kind of true intersectionality and really thinking about the fairness of these systems for everybody, and our simplification is, somewhere here. I don't know if you can see, but I hope you can see me sort of halfway there. Okay, so that's great. But in practice, our simplification is usually, somewhere here or even perhaps somewhere over here. And so the trick is kind of, I think, continuously trying to align ourselves with the social, like we are doing fairness work, not for the technical excitement or sort of mathematical, rigmarole, but because this actually matters in the world and for the social impact. And so I very much, applaud all of the ML researchers who are at FACT, who are trying to learn from this very interdisciplinary group of people. And I feel like, I'm being on this panel, even I'm sort of learning from all the other panelists and really thinking about like, how do we move forward in these simplifications towards a better simplification? Like how do we align our loss functions and objectives with what the actual true complex problem is? And I think that the biggest trick in machine learning, right, is to not become complacent once you define a particular task or a particular benchmark, to not say, okay, this is the benchmark for intersectionality. Like if your model works well in this metric, intersectionality solved, done. Let's now optimize, it works 80% today, and then by next year, let's have it work 85%, and by next year, let's have it work 90%. No, it's not going to work like that, right? By next year, we have to have redefined this metric or this task to be more complex, to take into account these sort of more, additional complexities. And so I think that's kind of, I know it's not quite an answer of sort of what simplifications are acceptable. I mean, I think we have to be, it's a moving target. We have to continuously be pushing ourselves to make sort of fewer and fewer simplifications, or make simplifications that are better and better aligned with our ultimate goal or with the sort of social literature on this topic.
Thank you, Olga. And I think it's so important, the emphasis that you put on really thinking very critically about these socio-technical systems and recognizing that we are making these simplifications and need to improve always in this area. And Jimmy, a lot of your work talks about as well, how do we think about a large number of intersectional groups? So would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the large number of groups, I first want to mention you don't necessarily have to have it blow up and open Pandora's box, right? So in Kimberlee Crenshaw's original paper, she was just looking at, binary gender and binary race. So there you have 4 intersectional groups. That's not the end of the world. And if you add in non-binary, then you'd have 6 intersectional groups. And so even just looking at that many intersectional groups is already a big advance over the status quo of like binary groups or just one dimension. So I would start there. But if you want to go beyond that and have a very large number of intersectional groups, some technical challenges arise. And so the main one I will talk about is small data at those intersections. So how do you kind of model that when you might have, 0 in some entries of your matrix of protected attributes? You might have 0 counts in there. So the first approach to do this was the paper that Cynthia mentioned, called Subgroup Fairness by Kearns et al. So they basically build this into the fairness definition so that it will kind of generalize from your data set. They designed it so that if you even have small counts or whatever in your data, that they won't kind of wreck your fairness metric. So that's great, but their goal was to prevent this fairness gerrymandering, right? They were not motivated by the philosophical goal of intersectionality, which, as I was saying earlier, I think there's more to it than that. The existence of oppression and caring about minorities and so on. And so one issue from that perspective with their definition, which, I think it's a great paper, but the issue is that it downweights minority groups. And so if you care about minority groups, then maybe you won't use that definition. Then you need to deal with this issue of the small data. So my group has worked on approaches to this. One is estimating fairness from data using Bayesian models. So we're basically trying to interpolate the data using some kind of model that tries to kind of guess at the cells in our fairness of the attribute count matrix that are small, how the algorithm behaves on them. So we can basically think of that as a simple classification problem where you compute the probability of the class label given a vector of protected attributes. And so we try, all the standard models, naive Bayes, logistic regression, deep neural networks, and so on. We also proposed a kind of hierarchical model which tries to kind of interpolate between the data and the model. And so it works out that if you have a lot of data in a particular cell, it would kind of default to the the actual raw counts. But if you don't have much, then it kind of defaults to doing a logistic regression on it. And this all fits within one model, and it works out quite nicely. We also have to deal with this when learning. So in the long paper of our ICDE paper, we're still submitting a journal article on this. We look at how do you learn when you have sparse data in a mini batch in terms of this intersectional counts. And we're just using stochastic approximations to try and kind of average over multiple mini batches to try and guess at what should be in those cells. So those are some technical approaches that you could use to try and deal with this data sparsity issue with intersectional subgroups.
Thanks, Jimmy. So moving a little bit from the technical to the socio-technical. So, of course, one challenge in the algorithmic fairness space is that oftentimes we think sort of descriptively about machine learning models, but ultimately when we think about fairness, it's a very normative question. And so, Cynthia, I'm curious, so how can intersectionality inform how we can think more normatively about our models and in particular their societal implications?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not being flippant. I really do care, and I'm really confused. And I mean, even let's just take one step back to an earlier point of confusion in my view of the world, which is when you say the word intersectionality, you're sort of saying there are different groups that we care about and we're concerned about their intersections, or there are different axes that we care about and we're concerned about their intersections. And one of my questions is, how do we even know that we are looking at a sufficiently complete set of axes to begin with? I believe that we're probably, human understanding evolves, and understanding of discrimination and the fact that there has been discrimination along a specific axis that maybe hasn't been examined before. And we talked about ableism. Maybe that hasn't been examined. And how do we get, what is the method for surfacing these different axes? And not to mention making sure they're represented in the data. And I think that, you were talking, there was discussion, like Yolanda, about issues of power. Well, the people who are powerful may not even be aware, and they may absolutely have no interest in sort of discovering a new dimension in which they are advantaged. The people who are disadvantaged have enough to deal with without having to to fight for themselves and take all that energy and mobilization and so on. And then on top of it, I'm concerned that people may internalize society's view of them and accept as normal and appropriate treatment that in fact is quite biased. And so, can we talk a little bit? I'm so curious to hear what the members of the panel have to say about even choosing axes or choosing new axes. And I'm going to sort of throw out a flag here that one of the things that's going on in theoretical computer science is to try to do this automatically by naming complexity classes. Anything that you can recognize from the data in a circuit of this size or a decision tree of that size, sort of automatically handled. But so anyway, I would just love to hear people's comments.
Yeah, thank you, Cynthia. Yeah, would other folks on the panel like to address that?
I don't mind speaking up quickly. So I think the points that Cynthia and Jimmy have raised are true to form. And what I mean by that is intersectionality is very complex. It's designed for complex problems. There is no simple answer. The more you do this work, the more you realize that you're overlooking someone, right? And so what I find to be useful about intersectionality is what it does. And what I mean by that is bringing to the level of consciousness that you are leaving someone out. And so you start somewhere. And so I think you have to make a conscious decision about on what degree of inclusion am I going to start, knowing that you're not going to include everybody at once. So I'll give you an example of a study that I did recently with Black youth that was tied to a community-based center. I wanted to understand from their perspective when it came to these speech-based interfaces, such as the Siris and the Google Assistants in the world that we all rely on, and Alexa and etc. I wanted to understand what their experiences were, because I already knew that these technologies had not been designed for children, first and foremost, let alone specifically Black youth. But I still wanted to understand interactions because they have access to this technology. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere we go. It's around us on our phones, etc. And sure enough, these kids who identified as being Black probably never even thought about class, right? Probably didn't necessarily even think about racism. But in doing this study to understand how they were interacting with these kind of technologies, I began to see that class mattered. So while they had smartphones and access to these speech-based interfaces, the kinds of information that was perceived as being useful for this generation of students that I was working with, who were identified of being of low socioeconomic status, questions about the weather were not important to them. When they thought about their interactions with these technologies, it was in the context of making fun of them for the simple fact that they were inadequate in terms of what their needs were. So for them, these technologies failed to meet their expectations, and just simple things such as information along the lines of Black history. A simple question about, who Harriet Tubman is, provided a very simplistic answer along the lines of when she was born. And yes, she's associated with the Underground Railroad, but nothing about the fact that she had led Union soldiers, that she was very successful and the most successful conductor in charge of the Underground Railroad. It was a very simplistic definition. So you begin to start asking questions such as, what is the data set in which this was based, the model for these systems was based? And so here you begin to realize, well, obviously Black history wasn't the main crux in which they were collecting this data set. So we have issues of race, but we also begin to see issues of language. So the way that these kids speak to each other, we know that if you think back to how we spoke to each other when we were much, much younger, that is colloquial, true. But again, where is the effort put forth in understanding how young children speak to each other? And then when you add the element of race and class, what does language look like? Well, the dominant language here is mainstream English. So this is where you begin to realize what are those specific axes that have been ignored. Okay. And so you start somewhere, and that begins to tease apart what's not being evident. And you start somewhere from the context of choosing a population that's typically not thought of in the terms of the data set that's informing these algorithms. You start there because they can quickly critique and tell you, what's missing and what's perspective. I'll say one more thing. When I asked them how they envisioned these technologies, if they were the ones that were in charge of designing these technologies, what did they see to be most useful? The youth talked about having technologies that help them to realize their personal goals. And the reason why that was so important, they thought of these technologies as they could be reimagined as life coaches. And that's significant because if you're coming from a low socioeconomic status, you're dreaming of a life in which you are moving up the economic ladder. And so technology that helps you to move from one class to another is important, even though you're not thinking of it along the lines of class. Those of us who understand those nuances can quickly pick up. This becomes a class issue. And class is something that affects more than just Black people. And so by starting somewhere with a population that's typically overlooked, you begin to basically peel back the onion to understand what other groups have been left out of the picture. And so you begin to really go around, if you will, interacting with these different groups, but not as objects of study, as co-designers, as co-producers of these technologies, which means that the way that we develop these algorithms, I'm pushing back and saying that we have to rethink that process. That is what I'm pushing back on.
Thanks so much, Yolanda. I think that's an excellent and such an important perspective to bring into this whole discussion, that at the end of the day, we are talking about people who really need to be part of this whole process and rather just as objects of study. And Eugene, did you have some points you want to add to this as well?
Yeah, so just building off of what Cynthia and Yolanda just said, I think it's important to kind of switch the focus of intersectional fairness research on the intersectionality of attributes, like protected attributes. So race, gender, class, and what is the right thing to consider, but rather switch our focus to the intersectionality of structural operation and making changes in such intersectional operation. So one thing I consider and kind of critique in my paper is that the current sort of overemphasis of intersectionality of attributes, like, there were like racial biases. So Black people are biased against by facial recognition algorithms and loan approval algorithms and also hiring algorithms and so on. And then there's Black women versus Black men. And that's not enough, like Black women with disabilities and without disability and so on and so forth. So one thing I point out is that if we focus too much on this attributes, then it could fall into sort of a dilemma between, so if we try to consider all possible axes or attributes, that it will fall into a sort of infinite regress, because like race, gender, disability, that's not enough, and class, language, so on and so forth. So that is like infinite regress. Or in order to stop the infinite regress, we have to stop somewhere. Then it could be like Cynthia pointed out, it could be some sort of fairness gerrymandering, because like, yeah, if we consider only race and gender, for example, that could be some kind of arbitrarily selection of attributes because it does not consider disability, like ableism. So instead of focusing too much on this current, intersectionality of attributes, I think it's important to look at how we can actually make changes in this intersectional structure of racism, sexism, ableism, and so on. So one thing I analyze in my paper is, this well-known ProPublica study of this recidivism prediction algorithms that are basically biased against Black people and communities of color, especially poor communities of color. They are getting more sentences than otherwise similar white, middle class people, for example. And yeah, well, of course, I think it's a step forward to intersectional fairness when we consider, this race and also class and things like that are important when we talk about intersectionality. But what's more important is that I think how we could reframe the purpose of algorithms. So the focus of algorithmic development has been how we can accurately predict well, recidivism, well, who will commit new crimes? So how this algorithm accurately, predicts that. And because that is based on the current and existing data set, that is based on mass incarceration of Black people and also this racial economic inequality that is biased against, well, poor communities of color. So if we focus too much on this accuracy, that it could just reflect and also reproduce current pattern of biases that's existing in the society. So instead of that, I would suggest more stronger notion of fairness, like how we can make changes in this structural intersectional oppression of racism and economic class inequality, and how can you redesign the algorithm to oppose such the mass incarceration of poor communities of color, for example? So I don't have a perfect answer, but I think maybe switching the focus of the current practice of fairness research, and especially the intersectional fairness research, this sort of change from the accuracy and what axis, what attributes we should consider, that's important, but I think what's more important is that how we can make changes in the current intersectional structure of operation.
Great, thank you. Oh, Jimmy? Yes.
So just picking up on some same threads that people have been saying. So Yolanda said we have to start somewhere. I totally agree with that. Eugene is saying that we need to look at our society and like who is being harmed. I think a lot of this is, at least as a starting point, is codified in law, right? So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, gives a list of protected attributes that the law cares about, gender, race, nationality, skin color, sexual orientation, I think, are some of the main ones. I may have missed one or two. So those places you can look for an initial list, and I think that gets you really far. And you can look in the literature as well, what are people talking about in the humanities and so on that they think that these intersecting oppressions are the ones that we should talk about. So if you go back even to 1851, Sojourner Truth wrote this famous speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" And so you can see here why this has been picked up on even now, because ain't, that's like Black, and then woman is gender, so race and gender. And she was talking about the how she was not treated the same as white women. And then if you look at Kimberlee Crenshaw, she's talking about initially Black women, right? But then from there, intersectional feminists went further. Patricia Hill Collins and people like that started thinking about how do we connect that with class and disability and so on. So I think it's worth looking at the literature to see what groups have been emphasized in the humanities and law and so on.
Thank you. So we'll transition soon to audience Q&A, but just to wrap up on this session first, I wanted to end by asking Yolanda about some of the points you mentioned earlier in terms of the participation of folks who are actually potentially marginalized by technologies, and how do we think kind of beyond algorithmic interventions into this broader space of actually intervening on a more socio-technical front?
I'll talk briefly because I think Cynthia wants to say something, but I'm talking about acknowledging that within our own community, we as academic researchers have a degree of power and privilege. And so it's really about how do you use that power and privilege to redistribute so that those who are not empowered have power and have choice and have influence. And so I'm a human-computer interaction person. That's where that's my background, that's my training. I'm not someone that's trained in AI or algorithmic fairness or things of that nature. So the emphasis from an HCI perspective is always the people first, technology is second. With that being said, when you are talking about intersectionality as the basis for which we're trying to create and imagine a more equitable world or society, then you start with the people. And so for me, the challenge is thinking about how we are developing these algorithms. Are they limited to those of us who are privileged and empowered? And that includes myself. Or are we expanding those opportunities for the very people who are going to be impacted by these technologies, for them to have a voice, a seat at the table, and how these technologies are designed. And so what that looks like means that we're not just using this power metric of, well, I've been formally trained, I'm the expert. Oh, you're not trained in this, you don't have anything to offer. It's saying, no, yes, every community has assets. They are communities of wealth. They have something to offer. And so if we position them as experts of their lived experiences, surely they can contribute and guide the conversation in terms of how we develop these algorithms so that they don't inflict harm, even though it's unintentional sometimes. They don't inflict harm. So that's my pushback. And Cynthia, I give you the floor.
Thank you. I just wanted to, I think everything you said, Yolanda, is fantastic. I just wanted to respond to this. I emphasize that yes, there are all sorts of categories that have been written about. Those are the easy ones. We know how to get our hands on those. A couple of years ago, I was listening to a lecture. It was a lecture about the thoughts of a religious woman. I don't remember what century, but it was a few centuries ago. And she prefaced her remarks with the comment of, obviously, I have no right to have an opinion on this because I'm just a woman. And that's if she was not being tongue-in-cheek, that's exactly the issue that I want to get to. It's like, how does one decide that, yes, actually women should be considered when considering fairness, not to mention algorithmic fairness. So it's these implicit assumptions that one is under, of accepting the undervaluing. That's the difficult part. So what are the things, what are the classes that are undervalued that have not yet been the subject of study? How do we make sure that we're more universal? How do we think outside the written box, the things that people have already studied? And that's where I'm hoping complexity theory can help. Help, not solve, but help.
Fascinating.
Great, thank you. Thank you all so much for your insights and expertise in this area. So now we'll open things up for any audience questions. So do we have any virtual questions, Nikki? Okay, great. And again, okay, great, we have a line forming. I guess we can start with the in-person and then go over to the virtual question.
Okay. So I have a paper length rant about this on Thursday, I think right before Eugene. But I think like there are certain things taken for granted when AI fairness community thinks about identity, even with an intersectional framing. And I think this resonates a lot with what Eugene was saying. So like it tends to assume identity as discrete, so separate categories rather than a spectrum. It tends to assume identity as static, so it's like unchanging over time and space, when like that's not the case. And essential, so like that these are intrinsic qualities of being rather than sort of like co-constructed constantly with the people around you. So I guess I think like I agree that abstraction is necessary, especially when it comes to technical systems, but these abstractions seem to directly be in conflict with how identity operates interpersonally and immobilizing these extant categories among us. So I guess to the more technical people on this panel, I'm curious if you've considered this fluidity and sort of like the interactiveness of how identity is constructed and thought about how it's possible to allow this fluidity within our existing models, which currently require discrete categories, whether that's supervised or unsupervised learning.
Feel free to jump in.
I think it's a really important question. So I don't have the answer. I think it would be great if you can figure something out, and I would love to hear about it.
Anyone?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in as well, but I also don't have an answer. I will say that I think right now, so I've been talking about algorithmic fairness at CVPR over the past couple of days to a computer vision audience, and one of the things that I'm mentioning is like the question about who is so a lot of the time we work with photos, right? And there's when we talk about gender or race in photos or whatever, we don't even talk about race, we talk about skin color, and we talk about lighter or darker skin, really. And so I've been raising sort of the question of like, right, who is doing the annotation? How does the bias of the annotators factor into this? And it seems to be blowing people's minds. Like, this is the level at which, you know, this is where the community is at right now. And so I very much hear you on these more complex questions. I think this is sort of, I'm hoping this is where the machine learning fairness community, you know, the sort of technical community is moving to, being able to accept these much more complex definitions. And I'm hoping we're moving there quickly, but for now, I think I don't think it's quite considering this level of complexity, but it should be.
Okay, thank you. And then the virtual question.
Or no.
Okay, we can hear you now.
Okay. Our first virtual question is from Genevieve Smith, approaching intersectionality and algorithmic fairness by including protected characteristics and the intersection of those. This would be challenging globally and likely carry a heavy US or Western focus. There are different protections for different identities in different countries, and some countries also make certain identities illegal. Example, illegal to be gay in several countries. So how do we operationalize intersectionality and algorithmic fairness at a global scale in concrete ways that deal with these challenges and differences?
Excellent question. Does anyone want to, Eugene? Or?
Yeah. So I think both, well, in-person questions and this virtual question points out to the problem of this, what I call this overemphasis of intersectionality of attributes and characteristics. Because when we focus on, well, for example, like, well, or race, and I do a lot of research recently on this philosophical approach to Asianness and Asian identity. That's not an aesthetic thing, and even myself, when I just was born and grew up in South Korea, I've never really thought of myself seriously as an Asian, or that was not very kind of vivid to myself. But when I moved to the U.S., then that it becomes my kind of major identity as a woman of color. And also this Asianness itself is not a discrete thing, and it means differently in global context, like in South Korea or in Asia or in the US, or the Western focus setting. And in the US also, there is this, for example, well, I'm mainly talking about Asian identity because I can't speak on behalf of other racialized people. So it's based on my kind of personal experience as philosophical research as well. Then this Asian identity is sometimes privileged, like model minority, especially in STEM settings. You know, Asian, this will stereotype that Asians are good at math or engineering and things like that. But also in the time of COVID-19, there was this, you know, anti-Asian hate against this Asian people. So this basically yellow parallel identity to Asian people. So this same Asianness, the Asian identity itself means different in different contexts and different power relations and global settings and so on and so forth. So instead of like, it's just enforcing some sort of statistical parity approach, like some parity of statistical measures, whatever it is, between, for example, white people, Asian people, Black people, and so on, that's a step forward. But what it's more important is that this colonialism is working at the global scale, and also even within the U.S. or Europe, this Western context. So I'm not arguing that what I'm saying, this redirecting the focus to the structure itself is not perfect, and it's certainly not solving all the problem. But I think because we are too hyper focused on this, there are Asian people, Black people, Latinx people, white people, so we enforce some sort of, for example, parity of accuracy rates or parity of false false race, whatever error race or things like that across the board, then that misses the point that this like colonialism is working, and colonialism and sexism is working together. And if we design some algorithms like hiring algorithms that are biased against women of color, then how we can make algorithms to actually fix this biases in society rather than here are Asian women and Black women and white women. We have all the same hiring chances for all groups. That's better than not considering intersectional operation at all. But that's certainly missing the point that what people have just pointed out rightly, like the global setting and this fluidity of identity that's changing in relation with the power dynamics globally and within the Western context as well.
Great, thank you. So we are a little bit over time, so I'm very sorry that we weren't able to get to all the questions, but please feel free to come over here to ask the panelists afterward. And thank you all so much for joining in the session, and enjoy the break.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we're no longer on camera.
I have no idea. Let's do something crazy and see if anybody notices. Yeah,
It was such a pleasure to hear what the two of you had to say. Really. Olga, you're in Princeton.
Mm-hmm.
I recommend, if you can, try to have a conversation with Guy Rothblum, who is currently living in Princeton for a while. I think it could be really interesting. I'd also be really happy to talk to you myself, just a little bit more about some of the technical things that you mentioned.
Yeah, I would love to. I'm sorry, tell me again the name.
Yeah.
Guy Rothblum.
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
I was thinking about that last question. I really don't, this is just me talking, again, not an AI person. I really don't think the goal is to design technology that works for everybody. I almost think there has to be a level of customization. I don't see a way that you can please everybody with just one technology. I don't think that's the goal. I don't think that should be the goal.
Right.
And I think the best you can do is make salient what your assumptions are. I'm building for this based on, this is my data set. This is where it comes from. Yes, I know I ignored such and such and such, but this is what this data set is for. And somebody else can pick that up and say, well, I'll go over here and work with this population, right? I think that's the best you can do. That saying you can't please everybody, you cannot please everybody. And then the other thing we have to remember about intersectionality is that there is social context which points to history, and this is how you get away from the whole US focused, meaning everything is through a US lens, because it is different in other countries, absolutely. And it should reflect those differences as opposed to the US dictating to everybody else how you're supposed to approach this. I think that defeats the whole purpose. So we have to remember that.
So we're working on a data set collection project right now that's less US centric, that's specifically trying to get data for object recognition from other countries, and it's crazy expensive and very difficult, and we are so excited. It's like one of the ongoing projects that we are just super into in my lab, because it's it feels important. It feels like it, because all of the data set, all of the computer vision data sets are all US centric, even though in theory we collected photos from the web, but of course photos from the web have US bias, and so we're trying to figure out if there's a way to sort of our answer right now is to basically hire workers in different countries, and that's great, but that involves throwing a lot of money at the problem. And you know, maybe that's the only answer, but hopefully, you know, we're trying to figure out if there's a way to do that in a way that the community will sort of buy as the new mode of data collection that's more global.
So I'm going to propose a new axis, and forgive me if you don't agree with me, but my new axis is going to be, does this person live in a place where abortion is available or not? Because I think it's going to be a huge axis, and I don't think people are paying attention to it yet. But and it's an example of, you know, gee, how come no machine learning has had that as one of the axes? Women versus women who don't have access to abortion.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just
No,
I agree. The historical context is going to be so. I think it's important. We can't ignore that. We just can't, right?
Right.
It's very powerful what you're saying, Cynthia. I mean, absolutely.
Anyway, it was an idea I just had, so please publicize it. Do it yourselves. Use it as an example. I just, you know, we had a whole hour discussion on fairness just on the eve of Roe v. Wade being overturned, and nobody talked about abortion. So in all of my discussions about fairness, I'm saying, how come nobody's talking about abortion? Why is that not one of the examples?
Yeah. Great point. Well, I've enjoyed. I wish we had. I think we should have had more time for questions, and we did.
Yeah.
We did. But no, this was. I wish we could do this again, and you know, oh well, we do it differently, right? More questions.
Yeah.
More questions we don't have answers to, but still, the questions are good. So.
Yeah, this was so much. I don't know. I would say so much fun, but also like this was so inspiring. Like, thank you both, and it's I don't know. I mean, Cynthia, I've read like probably all of your work on fairness, and we certainly we've like this has been a huge inspiration, and also you know this is what we build off of, and this is what we teach, and this is what I teach in classes and tutorials, and I don't know, Yolanda, just listening to you talk about these things, I'm like, I want to be more like you when I grow up. Like, I want to be better at articulating these things, and like this is what this is the level of complexity that I strive for, and think, and thinking about it from the